for listening to Screamtones, a webcomic podcast. Like what you're hearing? How about supporting us with Ko-fi? Doing so will help us with expanding production, unlock exclusive bonus episodes, and allows us more time for research and recording each episode.
Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday you said tomorrow. So just do it. Make your dreams come true.
Hello and welcome to Screamtones, a webcomic podcast. Today we're going to be talking about creating from references. I'm Finn, I use they them pronouns, and I create the webcomic Airs of the Veil.
And I'm Rennie. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomic Kate Blast.
I'm Delphina. I use she, her pronouns, and I make the webcomic Sombulus.
And I'm Miranda. I use she, her pronouns, and I create the webcomic Into the Swell.
Okay, so references are basically any visual aid that helps you draw something. You can use photographs, 3D models, live models, or just do a little pre-development work and draw reference sheets for characters or vehicles or outfits and anything that's going to go into your comic. In webcomics, we're drawing panel after panel after panel, and sometimes it's hard to stop and actually find the time to make good references, to find good references, and to use these references in a way that's beneficial for our work. So today we're going to talk about how we use references, what we do with them, and how to best apply them. So my first question goes to Rennie. Why and when do you use references?
So I use references constantly. I have a big time struggle with a lot of, environments and things like that. It's just not the way my brain envisions things. So for me, I really like to go and find a place that's similar energy, similar layout. And I go and I take pictures. I bring my own camera. I have, for the second half of chapter 3 of Kate Blast, I went and basically took a early morning ride on the local subway. Got on an empty train car, thank God, because it was like 5 degrees out that day, and took pictures for like an hour and a half. Got every single angle I needed for that entire scene, and it saved me a ton of time. So references I mostly use as ways to shave down the amount of time it takes to make the pages. That's really sort of, my biggest use for them.
Yeah, they can be really time saving. I think for me, I have not always been great about using references because I'm a goblin, so it took me a little while. I I love my characters and my story. I just want to get it out there and I don't want to stop to look for references or anything. I get in this mindset of, well, done is better than perfect. I tell myself my style is very cartoony, so it's okay if my drawings don't look extremely realistic. But there was a problem with that because as time went on, consistency became a bigger and bigger problem. I would forget belt buckles or the colors of shoes. Buildings from scene to scene would change. I wouldn't remember like, oh, where was the chair? I can't remember where the chair was in that room. And it took a lot of time to just try to jog my memory every single page, every single time I needed to come back to a scene. And so that's when references kind of came into my process. I would take about, 20 minutes or something to just draw a quick sketch of all of my characters and the costumes that they were wearing, the base colors, just have that all together on a sheet, get some pictures together of various moods or scenes or something like that that I could kind of draw maybe a color palette or a theme from if I was trying to get a place to look all consistent. And sometimes I've kind of gotten into 3D models. I'm not the greatest at hunting them down. I really need help with hunting down usable models or making my own. But there's been a couple of times when I've found some 3D models from other places, SketchUp Marketplace or whatever it's called, where it just somebody's already made this Starbucks like photorealistic and it's free to use and so just having that in my bucket saves me so much time because then I don't have to search for a bunch of pictures of Starbucks. So, yeah, references. Even though I was resistant, they're growing on me.
This is why you just don't give your characters any accessories or tattoos or distinguishing extra features, because then you don't have to remember them.
I'm not that smart.
I know. I'm not either. I don't think any of us are. But yeah, I never received any professional training as an artist. So everything that I've started learning to do for my comic has all been self-taught, and references have been a lifesaver, and I primarily use them for anatomy and poses. They help me kind of make sure my pose is correct. I mean, if I try to draw something without a reference and I see it just looks off and I can't tell why, finding a reference of the same pose just allows me to say, oh, that elbow is too far back or too far forward, or the hand is off, and it just lets me tweak it to make it better. I do use the 3D models, specifically the Clip Studio Paint ones and the people models. I want to branch out into like environment and item 3D models, but that's very intimidating to me, so I haven't yet. But I love using the 3D models to get the poses and kind of get the base look of what I'm going for, or also dragging in multiple 3D models so I can get kind of the scene I'm going for and kind of see visually how all the characters are going to look in a panel and kind of figure out the best placement for everyone. And it speeds things up. It makes it sure that everything looks right in the end. And it also helps just consistency, because that's also something I've had a huge problem with. And I'm trying to get in the habit of doing reference sheets to help me remember the little things, like the fancy necklace that someone has or the tattoos that someone has, and having those all in one place so you don't have to flip back through all the pages you've done and find what you're looking for makes things so much easier.
Yeah, I think reference sheets can be a real lifesaver. It's really good to like have a folder with everything you need basically. I also think like you all made very good points, especially on, I think, Rennie, when you told that you went out, you took these pictures, you basically also experienced your reference, or it is something that you experience. I think that also kind of plays into it.
Yeah, it's so important. Like, if you have the ability to go out and see how the place you're drawing, see how it feels, what it smells like, the noises that you hear, it can sort of help you place more things in the environment. Like, if you know that you're making a scene on a subway, what time of day is it? Is it, middle of the day when it's, kind of empty, or are you drawing at a rush hour? And what does that feel like? So, and those can all sort of change the way you do a scene. Now, should you do that for every scene? Absolutely not, because that's a lot of time. But for certain scenes, it might be worth it.
Yeah, I think Delphi also mentioned color reference or color moods. That's something that's kind of dear to my heart, because I feel it's very important to not only have references for the technical stuff that we draw, but also, and that's primarily how I use a lot of references, is to just capture a mood, to references mood with colors or details within the scenes I'm constructing. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about why and when you all use references, how do you use your references? What are techniques or specific ways that you apply the reference that you have to the piece you're working on? And we'll start again with Rennie.
Yeah, so when I'm looking at sort of, drawing from the reference, the first thing I look at is the structure. I take a very constructivist approach to using a lot of references and sort of analyzing things of, okay, how do these pieces fit together? What are the basic shapes? And I oversimplify it when I'm looking at it. And, so I basically like try and pick out, okay, this shape is kind of like a circle, this is kind of a square, this is kind of a triangle, kind of how do they all mash together? And then that, breaking it down to those basic shapes helps you kind of fit it into your own style. Because one of the things you find with a lot of references you find online, especially on Google, is their art references. They're references that other people have drawn. So you can run into the problem of you start drawing in not your style, and then you all of a sudden you're like, oh no, this doesn't fit. This doesn't fit what I'm trying to do here. So it's, the more you can simplify it and break it down, the easier it'll be to sort of keep it in your own style and sort of, keep it all consistent. One of the ways that I personally use references more so than in the comic is in my practice. I go and, I look and do and practice all this constructivism, on the side, fill up sketchbooks with just, okay, these are like 10 pages of hands. Let's see what shapes make up these hands. How do they bend? How can I exaggerate them? Because, sometimes if you're drawing from photo reference, it doesn't necessarily translate to like an anime or a cartoonish style. So you have to, learn how the structure is in order to exaggerate it. So that's the biggest way that I use references when I'm implementing them.
Yeah, that's very true. I also think that sometimes, especially if you use live references, they can look extremely awkward, and you have to kind of learn how to deconstruct them and how to make them look a little bit better to fit your style. I would be interesting, Delphi, you said that you were kind of like adverse to using references because you just want to create your comic, but I'm super interested because your comic has a fantasy setting. How do you use references there, and what's your process in using references for that?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, back in college, there's a lot of basics you get in drawing and figure classes to break people and still lifes and stuff into shapes. And like Rennie says, if you have the chance to take a live drawing class with a figure, I highly recommend it. There's a lot of community colleges or just like even things around, like you get those little mailers that have all the little courses that you can take, so sometimes they're not too expensive at all, and having somebody to explain, okay, here's how you break down segments of the body is great. But to your point, I'm doing a fantasy comic and sometimes like I'm trying to draw people flying. Where am I going to find pictures of people flying? I'm not. I have to There's a lot of things I can use from real life still, but sometimes I can't. I do trace pictures. I have that background from drawing and figure classes, so I'm very fairly confident in how I can deconstruct things, and breaking things up what I see in the pictures does help. I take pictures of weird poses, just selfies or something like that, or facial expressions, especially when like I'm not in a sketching mood, I'm just having trouble getting a sketch down for whatever reason. I can just take the picture, drop it into my page, and go from there.
That just reminds me of the thing that was going around Twitter a while ago. That was, if you're having trouble drawing swords and people holding them and holding them at weird angles, look at tennis players. And it's like you can very easily find pictures of tennis players online. And that just, your comment on finding people, flying thing reminded me of that.
Yeah, I've also seen conductors. If you're drawing magicians, look for pictures of conductors because like they're waving their hands around, or a baton that could look like a wand or something like that. You do have to get a little creative sometimes. I think for flying, a lot of times I'm looking for football players that are tackling people. Trampolines are kind of hit and miss because people are usually not like trying to move forward or do a natural momentum on a trampoline. They're just kind of like going up and then down, and that's not typically how people move. But a lot of times I'm just kind of figuring out flying on the fly. But and sometimes, I'm just looking up Superman. There's a million Superman pictures out there, and you know what? That does help me figure out, okay, what is he doing with his arms? What is he doing with his legs? And kind of go from there. So that's always helpful. Also, I used past Delphina as reference a lot. So if I've started sketching stuff and maybe I don't use it, maybe I decide that, oh, I don't need this panel because it doesn't work narratively, but I still like how it looks, I will copy and paste that into another separate document. I sort them out by character. Each character has a sketch page document of all the sketches I didn't use of them. And sometime later, it always comes up when I'm trying to draw something and I'm like, oh, I need a picture of Sydney. I'll go look in my Sydney folder and I'll find a picture that's very similar to what I want and I'll just retrace the same sketch. Even if it has been in the comic before, it'll never be 100% the same, but like I figured it out once, I can take advantage of it again. And then sometimes one of my sneaky tricks for vehicles or robots, because those are really hard for me to break down sometimes. Like if I'm looking at a car, I never took car drawing classes. I don't know like how to conceptualize that sometimes. And whenever you trace a car, it's got that weird kind of look. I think you know what I mean. And I'll Google coloring books. I just do a Google for like bug coloring book. Somebody has made a VW bug coloring book and they've simplified the line work in a way that I can understand better. So that's also a little sneaky trick. And you don't want to trace these, but it does help you understand for how you can construct it too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That's also, especially that you can reuse pictures basically to trace, to have like this more streamlined process. I think I wanted to ask Miranda the same or a similar question because Into the Swell is also a comic with a fantastical setting, but also the general question how you use references.
Luckily, I feel like while my comic is a fantasy, it doesn't have, like, I don't have anyone flying yet. I do have a mermaid figure, but there's plenty of mermaid pictures out there. I know, or my wizard, he doesn't require a wand, so he uses his hands a lot. So I have so many pictures on my phone of me making strange hand motions that I think Kelwyn would do while he's casting this spell. And then I can use that as my reference. I do that a lot. While I like the 3D model aspect, sometimes you just have a pose in your head or you have something in your head and you can't find the exact picture somewhere that or the exact reference that fits what is in your head. So you just have to take a picture of it yourself. So I have so many pictures in my phone of weird hand motions, weird facial expressions, or strange poses that look very odd for me, but they translate perfectly into what I'm going for in the comic panel. The nice thing when it's a picture you take of yourself or like a Clip Studio 3D model, there's no bars on what you can do with it because it's well, like a picture of myself is owned by me, so I can do whatever the heck I want with it and no one can say anything about it. So I can use that, and I like to kind of trace the pose that I have a lot to kind of just get the basic skeleton, like where the elbow is, where the wrist is, like all those important joints, just so I have the accurate to reference picture of what I'm wanting. And then once I have that base skeleton, it's easier for me to like fill in where all the muscles go and where the fingers go and everything from there. But just figuring out that base structure is always the hardest part and always takes me the longest. So using the reference that I create or find helps me kind of jump forward a little bit and speed that up.
Yeah, is there something you would particularly keep in mind when using 3D models? Something you noticed is, I don't know, especially difficult when using them, for example?
They don't fit your style initially, especially for me. I noticed that it takes a lot of tweaking for me. If I try to copy it from start to finish, in the end, it doesn't look like something I would have drawn naturally. So it is something to keep in mind. Don't feel locked in by the references you have. Be sure to like use them to get started and then step away so then the rest of the piece will develop in a way that fits your style and fits you naturally. And I think that also helps you grow a bit more than relying on it through the entire process.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I also think that sometimes it can be a little bit difficult if you use 3D references, especially for me personally, something like SketchUp, because I would just put so much time into building apartments for characters perfectly, and it would eat a lot of time that could have like gone into drawing. And sometimes the reference that I would build in SketchUp became kind of unusable because it took ages for the model to load, because I would just put so many details into it. And also, which is kind of sad, but SketchUp has become like a little bit weird. Using it has become a little bit like inconvenient, so I think it's not the best reference for 3D scenery housing models anymore. And I also think a lot of people, when they use like 3D references, a lot of people just build houses in something like The Sims. Rennie. Okay, so I wanted to know, because your comic is also science fiction and there's aliens and spaceships. How do you work with references there? Because that would really interest me.
Oh my gosh. So, uh, I for a lot of that stuff, I go in with the general aesthetic of, okay, I want to be consistent with this, and then I approach using that aesthetic to make some reference documents. And I do have reference documents for a bunch of different design things, for some ships, for interiors of the ships, for uniforms and things like that. Personally, I know I'm not very good at designing ships. I have tried; it's not a strength of mine, but I know people who it is their strength. So if you don't be afraid to go out and commission people to help you make the references you need, because people will absolutely eat that up and be like, yes, absolutely, pay me $100 and I'll give you a ship. Hell yeah. um, that's how I got the design of the big ship in mind. So if you're having a hard time getting started with like a particular asset or a particular thing, and you're finding, boy, I can't do cars. How do I design a car? Find someone on Twitter who is good at designing cars and be like, "Hi, here's some money. Can you make this for me?" I know for some people that's not necessarily going to be an option, but maybe see if you can get tips from friends who have that trick that's very good, that have that skill set. But yeah, so like definitely don't be afraid to reach out for help on some of the things you're struggling with for references, and it's pick a theme, pick an aesthetic, and be consistent, and then you can make anything work in sci-fi. Like, I've seen people create references for ships by like, all right, I got this Pringles can, I've got this eraser and a Magic the Gathering card, and you just lay them out and be like, all right, I'm gonna make a ship out of this, and you can do it. So the world is your oyster, and so is the galaxy.
I mean, yeah, that's like something that I think people overlook a lot. Like you can like kind of hobble together if you have Legos or anything like that you can stick together in real life to make a 3D model that works in real life. You can like lift it up, you could take it from different angles and stuff like that. I mean, that's how a lot of classic film worked in back in the day. They were using miniatures and stuff. So for cars, I know people who buy toy cars, they toy spaceships or whatever.
I have a 1/10th scale model of a Harley Davidson motorcycle, which is the exact model of motorcycle that Kate rides in my comic. So,
Exactly.
and I found it online for $20.
Yeah, you can just like troll for toy stuff, because especially for vehicles. And I mean, obviously if you put the Millennial Falcon in your comic, you might get issues, but like maybe don't do that. But there's a lot of generic type stuff, and yeah, if you need a tractor, find a tractor. It's there's so much there. If you're working with like real life stuff or sci-fi stuff, just go to the toy aisle. That's my advice.
I mean, models nowadays are super detailed, so I think they can actually be really useful. Yeah, so I think that resumes that question. What are specific things that someone should keep in mind when using references?
Definitely be mindful of sort of the amount of time that it takes to get the reference, because like we've said it before, the biggest perk of using references is cutting down on the amount of time and effort you need to put into each page. Because just keep in mind that the average reader only spends 5 to 10 seconds on each panel. So if getting one reference for one panel is going to take you 7 hours to do and make, it might not be worth it. Like, because as Finn mentioned, like SketchUp or even Blender, those all have steep learning curves, and you're going to have to spend hours and hours and hours learning the software to make something that's usable. So for those more complicated references that you're going out and making and finding, it might not be worth it if it's just for one or two panels or for a single page. But if it's like, this is the apartment in which the person lives and is a main setting in the entire comic, it might be worth it to go and spend 8 hours making something that you will be using for like half the comic. Or if if it's a sci-fi thing, it might be worth it to make a 3D model of the ship that your crew is flying in, things like that. So just keep in mind the amount of time that you're putting into making and acquiring the references. For me, I said before, I went out, took photos of the subway system and everything, and yes, it was for like only half of one chapter, but for me, it was local. It was somewhere that I was going anyways. So I was able to make that work conveniently. So never feel like you have to like, oh, I have a comic that's going to be set in Area 51. All right, I'm going to book a flight to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then I'm going to go out to Area 51. No. You don't have to do that.
Don't raid Area 51. That's not good for your health.
Don't raid Area 51. It's not worth it for your comic. So just be mindful of the amount of time you're putting in. Yeah.
Yeah, it is important. Like, because that's always been my hang up about using references is that they should save time. They shouldn't take more time. And I think one of the things that I try to keep in mind, and especially when I'm hearing about people starting a new webcomic and they're like, I have to get all my references together and I have to know every single setting and every single detail and make this big old reference book. I'm like, are you doing this because that's going to make things easier for you, or are you doing it because you're afraid of starting? I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people hide behind references because they are afraid of starting. And use your references. They're absolutely good, but they are tools and they don't mean anything. Tools don't mean anything unless you use them. So get them in use early and often. You'll learn a lot by doing and not just by having the shiniest toolbox. I mean, yeah, you need to use them basically. And one of the things Miranda was saying earlier, sometimes things look off and you can't see why. Maybe there's an elbow that's not in the right place. And most of your readers aren't going to really have the art training to say, "Ah, yes, you drew that lamppost out of proportion or the face or whatever." But it will be in the back of their minds and can be subconsciously distracting them, pulling them out of the story. And I think the goal with references, especially for environment, isn't to photo render everything to perfection. A lot of times it's just to make all those details invisible and natural so that people don't even give them a second thought. People aren't paying attention to them. They're paying more attention to what your characters are doing. So sometimes the answer is, be a little more sparse on your detail work. I know I have a problem where like if I take a picture down a street of like a big crowd, I want to draw every single person in the crowd and over detail them. And you do have to kind of learn to abstract those details when necessary.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point because I think that using references also means, especially for scenery, also means to know and to learn how to simplify these references because that's also a problem that I have. I sometimes struggle with actually simplifying, so everything has to be detailed and then I put a filter or something over it that simplifies it for me. So if I can actually learn how to simplify and like take that step, that would save a lot of time. But I think often with references there's also this kind of threshold that you have to get over with because it is something that you have to learn how to use and that takes time, and learning new things can be difficult.
Yes, absolutely. You need to like figure out what the reference is doing for you. You have to, go in and saying, I'm using this reference because it's helping me with my proportions. Maybe not so much with my details. And just like blocking in things sometimes using a more painterly approach to like say, here's a splotch and this is the person. This is the most abstract person that I'm going to do is just this little dot in the distance, and here's the most detailed person I'm going going to do in the foreground. And that one you can see their hat and their buckles and their nose hairs or whatever. But then kind of drawing all the things in between, I think that can be a really helpful exercise for figuring out the level of abstractions that you want to incorporate. For me, also, I have a big problem with proportions of people to buildings or furniture or vehicles. So sometimes when I'm using 3D references, I have this like giant couch and this tiny person that I'm trying to like bend to sit on it, and it looks very unnatural. So if you're like me, sometimes pull out the camera. A lot of times I get like settled into my desk and I've got my drink and I'm sitting, I've got all my windows open and I don't want to get up for anything. But honestly, sometimes I really need to. I just need to like go take a picture of somebody sitting on the couch. You know, ask your husband, ask your roommate, whoever, to just go sit on the couch for you for 2 seconds, take the picture, and then you have the proportions you need. Because I think you can really get wrapped up in like models in isolation, but seeing them in a natural environment is going to help you render them more naturally.
Going back to the big shiny toolbox, I wish I could have a big shiny toolbox of everything, but the more I try to get a big shiny toolbox of like every detail, every scene, it does feel like I'm just putting off starting it. So I don't think that's quite that's quite something that works for me, but I always daydream about how nice it would be to have that. I think the time thing, making sure that what you're putting into the references you're getting and using is equivalent to what you're getting out of it is very important. I think another important thing to know is and pay attention to is just the limitations of the references that you're using. Some references you can find, like pictures you take of yourself or pictures you take yourself, you can use for any purpose whatsoever. You could even trace it if you really wanted to. If you're alternatively tracing pre-existing art or trying to use another person's artwork or another person's photos, you need to be aware of what the usage restrictions are of those references so you're not violating any copyrights or trademarks or making anyone upset by using it in your art. So that's very important to look out for.
But I also think that this leads us into another point, and that's basically resources. Where can people actually go to find references? Aside from the things we have already mentioned, like taking a camera and going outside.
I want to give a shout out here to one of my favorite resources. It's a Dorkastock. They run a site, that's all references. You can find basically hundreds and hundreds, I think thousands of at this point of photos of stock reference photos that they've gone out and taken themselves. Like, if you like, all right, I need someone floating in a pool, they have it. I need someone holding a sword or sitting on the ground, and like they have it. And they have this cool feature called the dorkastock.com/sketch that basically gives you a random pose. So like if you're trying to do studies for practice and learning, it is a great place to just dive in and be like, all right, I'm gonna use this as a reference and study it and learn from it.
I really like Photobash. I was trying to find their website. It's not photobash.com, but there's different artists, photographers that will put out packages of things that are intended for compositing together different pictures or whatever. So they'll take pictures around castles, they'll take pictures around, old factories or the ocean or all kinds of stuff like that, and they'll sell these picture packets for pretty cheap. And sometimes I think I'm on their mailing list is how I got it. But you can kind of, if you know you have a certain environment, you can search for blank photo pack and usually find a photographer that's selling like all kinds of angles and stuff for specific environments. So I really, really recommend that.
In addition to that, like those type of reference packs, I know I found a lot of good things on Sketchfab. That's a place that you can find a lot of pre-existing 3D models, and you can like rotate them and move them around and everything. I'm not sure about like actually loading them into an art program because I haven't done that, but they make for good pictures that you can take a look at.
I also know GitHub is another great 3D asset resource.
Yeah, I think also if you can get around to using SketchUp how it is now, the 3D warehouse is also still a very good place to find inspiration or 3D assets that you can rotate and look at. So that's also still pretty much available. Okay, speaking about SketchUp, I think that's it for this episode. I don't know how this relates, but thank you all for listening. I'm your host, Finn. You can find my comic on heirsoftheveil.com.
And I've been Rennie. You can find my work at kateblast.com.
I've been Delphina, and you can find my comic Somnolus at somnolus.com.
And I'm Miranda, and you can find my comic at intotheswellcomic.com.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for all your insights. It was great talking to you. And we'll see you next time here at Screen Tones. Bye.
Now I'm hungry.
Same.
What are we gonna get?
I'm going to take pictures of food so I can
Yeah.
Pictures of food.
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. Want to know some other ways to support us? Check out our Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/screentonescast, where your support will help us create more episodes, reach cool extra bonus goals, and keep us talking about anything and everything webcomics. You can also find us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and our Discord server. Thank you so much for listening, sharing, rating, and supporting, and we'll see you next time.